Let's talk about the gimbal mount that only takes a few seconds to switch from landscape shooting to portrait shooting. This is the newer vertical camera mount made for the DJI Ronin RS2, RS3, RS3 Pro, RS4, and RS4 Pro. In this video, I'll tell you some of the pros and cons I've had after using this extensively for my commercial video shoots. It's definitely a pretty genius concept, but there are a few quirks to it as well. With social media content taking over a lot in the small business and corporate world, it's likely that clients have already been asking you to film certain things in portrait, or at least want a portrait version of your landscape cut. While there are ways around having to shoot with a camera in portrait, such as adding an action camera on top of your rig, or simply cropping into your landscape footage, I'm sure we can all agree that nothing quite beats the quality that comes out of your actual camera filming in the proper orientation. Let's first take a look at the difference in time it takes to switch between landscape and portrait shooting with the newer mount and DJI's original vertical mount. This time-lapse includes rebalancing as well, since you will have to do this with either mount. I do have to say that it is significantly faster to do this with the newer mount though. Now, this time difference will depend on how fast you are at balancing your own gimbal. I've gotten pretty used to balancing my gimbal after a few years of using it, and I've also used my newer mount for quite a while now. That being said, it still takes me about 3 to 4 times longer to rebalance my gimbal if I'm using DJI's vertical mount versus NEEWER's vertical mount. Pretty crazy, right? If you're already sold on this mount, hold on a sec. Let's take a closer look first before you spend your hard-earned money, and more importantly, before you potentially make your shooting process much more difficult during a client shoot. So here we have the newer vertical mount that basically combines DJI's landscape mount and vertical mount into one piece. The newer mount has a few moving parts to it, as you can see here, and it's quite a bit heavier than the original two mounts because of these moving parts. And also because of the way it moves, it's also balanced differently, as you could see earlier in the video. I'm going to talk a little bit about the details here first. As you can see here, DJI has these horizontal tabs that allow you to tighten and loosen various parts of the mount. So this part here mounts onto the gimbal and is tightened with this tab here. And this tab over here mounts your camera plate onto the gimbal. NEEWER, on the other hand, has decided to replace these horizontal tabs with a knurled type of thumb screw. So as you can see here, there's a lot more adjustment points. This part here attaches to your actual gimbal. Both of these bolts over here attach your camera plate onto this mount. And this last one over here tightens and loosens this 180-degree rotating plate. On the back here, you also have a little locking tab that locks and unlocks the ability for this to rotate. The first thing I want to point out here is how hard it is to actually loosen and tighten these thumb screws properly, as opposed to using these horizontal pins. Because these are knurled, it kind of digs into your fingers so you have a little bit more grip, but overall, you still have to turn it with 2 fingers at most to tighten or loosen this. Whereas the DJI one over here gives you a lot more surface area to put 1 or 2 fingers on to fully tighten it whenever you need to. Same with the camera plate mount over here on the original DJI plate. To tighten it, you simply push this down and it's on there. So I'll grab the original plate here to show you. This simply slides in like so. And then when you want to tighten this camera plate onto the DJI mount, all you do is just push this tab down. And when you push this tab in, this tab pushes this piece over here that tightens this clamp onto this camera plate. Now NEEWER's over here has a thumb screw system. Now it has the same kind of little clamp that's hidden down here beneath this, but instead of a locking tab here, you have a thumb screw that tightens it and loosens it. Now to install this, same thing, you push it in like this, and then you have to tighten this thumb screw. Now I feel like it's much harder and it hurts my fingers a lot more to try to rotate this tight as opposed to DJI's original method where you just have a tab here and you just push it in. The first few times I used NEEWER's mount, I actually thought a lot of these thumb screws were tight, but it actually wasn't. And I couldn't tell because there's no indicator here that tells you when something is actually tight. Versus DJI's plates have these things here that tells you which way is locked and unlocked, and usually this goes almost all the way fully flat to make sure it's locked. What happened during those shoots was this screw over here that holds this entire thing and my camera onto the gimbal was actually not fully tight, and during my shoot, this whole plate worked itself loose and started sliding down the gimbal. If it wasn't for the safety latch on the gimbal, my whole camera would have fallen off. But since I've been using this for a while now on my commercial video shoots, I have found a trick to properly tighten this, which I'll show you later on in the video. Now another key difference that I noticed here is that both the original DJI plates have this little gear over here that lets you make micro adjustments. Now on your camera plate, on the underside, you'll notice that there's some gears here. And these gears are meant to be used with these gears here on the original DJI plates. And what that does is give you the ability to make micro adjustments by just turning this knob here. I'll do a little demonstration for you here. Once this goes in, you can use this knob here to make adjustments to your tilt axis. And I'm not too sure if you can see this, but there's little gears that turn as you rotate this knob. And this is what lets you make those really tiny adjustments to properly balance your gimbal. Whereas with NEEWERs, obviously there's no gears anywhere here, so once this goes in, you're free to kind of slide it however you want. This does make it much harder to do micro adjustments, but honestly, after using gimbal for so many years, balancing it without having these gears wasn't really an issue to me. I would just use two hands like this, and I find that the balancing part isn't too tricky at all, but it's definitely something to note. Both the NEEWER mounts and the DJI mounts have a safety pin, so on the off chance that this is loose and your camera wants to fall, it'll get stopped by the safety lock. The safety lock is over here on this side, and to release your camera plate from this mount, you have to hold that tab in and it comes out. And you can see that little tab right over here. Push it in from the side and it comes out. So when this is mounted onto your gimbal, this knob over here will be facing you, so you have to go like this to release your camera. As you can see here, both of the DJI plates have their release button on the front side. So if that's something that you're used to, it just takes a little second to get used to the NEEWER one, but I will mention that both of DJI's release pins are much bigger than NEEWER's release pin. I will say that the build quality of all of these are pretty on par, but definitely expect the NEEWER one to have a little bit more movement and not be quite as sturdy because it's not one full piece like the DJI plates are. Because it's a convertible plate, it has three pieces that you can see here. The first section I see over here allows it to rotate like so, and then the piece over here allows it to spin. I'll go into depth about why these three pieces are needed to change orientations a little bit later on in this video. The last thing I want to touch on that I thought was pretty interesting was that NEEWER made two knobs over here to secure this plate onto their mount. And you'll notice over here that you can't fully access this knob because the mount is in the way. So depending on if you have it in landscape mode, then you can access this outer one here. But if you change it over to portrait mode like this, they'll make you rotate this plate around. And now this bolt is blocked, but this one still stays accessible. I thought it was a pretty cool design because if they only had one knob on the one side, then when you rotate this, there's going to be an orientation where you can't actually take off the camera. But having these knobs on both sides means no matter which way this is rotated, you can still put on and take off your camera. Now that you know how the vertical mount works, let's take a look at how to switch the orientation. You just flick this tab to unlock it, and that allows you to rotate this part of the mount up. You go back down here, make sure you lock it into place, and that stops it from moving. On the back here, you undo the screw, and this allows you to rotate your camera 180 degrees so you can shoot it facing forward again. You tighten this back up, and then you have to rebalance the height of the tilt axis here. So undo that knob, right here is about good, tighten up this knob, and then you're good to go. And you'll notice here that this axis hasn't really changed, and it's still pretty well balanced. So I'm not too sure what it is about the NEEWER mount, but this is the Canon R7 that's on this gimbal right now. I've also tried the same thing with my Canon R5C and my Canon R5, and all three cameras have stayed relatively balanced despite if I'm shooting in landscape or in portrait mode. With a NEEWER vertical mount, this arm never has to get rebalanced in my opinion. The only thing that I do have to rebalance, as you've seen earlier, is just this part here for the tilt axis. In comparison, as you've probably seen earlier in the video, the DJI vertical mount is really off for this arm over here. And this whole thing with the DJI mount has to be rebalanced entirely when you switch from landscape to portrait mode. Now let's talk about some of the issues. This little knob over here really does hurt your fingers when you're digging into it, but also it's really hard to make sure that you've tightened this. And I'll give you an example over here. Say I'm loosening this to adjust the height of this on my gimbal. It's loose. If I let it go, it stays because the camera is pushing down against it and pushing out this way. So because this is a clamp system and there's a bit of grip inside here, it stays. If you go over here and you tighten this knob, and as you can see, I'm using a lot of force to tighten this. you'll think that it's tight. And then you go back out to shoot, you know, your camera's not moving around, everything's fine. And this is what happened to me during my first couple shoots with this mount. So even though it looks like it's sturdy and it's on there, I'm not too sure if you can tell on camera, but there's actually a slight bend over here right now. This plate is actually not perfectly straight and it's bowing out this way a little bit. And then when you're walking around, if you're bobbing up and down, what happens is your camera moves like this and then falls down. Luckily, there is a safety over here from the gimbal itself. But say if my camera was up here like this, while I'm shooting, it randomly comes crashing down, it would probably give you a heart attack too. And again, that's because this is not fully tight on the gimbal. So I found out the best way to tighten this is actually when you're adjusting this axis over here for the tilt. So once you have this in place, you want to tighten the knob like this and it doesn't go anymore. You think it's tight. But if you take your left hand and you actually support the weight of the camera and you push the camera up, what this does is take the weight off of the mount and the gimbal. And even though it's tight right now, with nothing supporting the camera, the second that you lift the camera up like this, you'll find that you can actually tighten it down quite a bit more. And now this is tight on there and it's not going anywhere. So after I found out the trick of actually supporting your camera properly, but also tilting it up and supporting the weight of your camera properly, this part has never been an issue for me again, thankfully, and it stayed on the gimbal pretty well. Now the second issue that I've had that I don't really have a fix for is the fact that this is actually 3 sections. So as you can see here, right now it's currently locked. But even though it's locked, you can still move the camera a little bit like this. And this becomes a really big issue because you don't know which way is perfectly straight. You could be shooting like this, or you could be shooting like this and all your footage is off by about 1 or 2 degrees. And it's not just this section too, it's also this rotating base plate as well. So as you can see, this knob back here is fully tight. Even if I really hold the bottom plate over here, you can tell that I can still rotate the camera a little bit. Now it doesn't let me rotate it anywhere past maybe 1 degree, but honestly 1 degree is all you need to start noticing that your walls are tilting in your footage. And that part has become quite annoying for me. Now that being said, I do still use this full time on my gimbal, and I've completely ditched DJI's original mounts because I like the fact that I can have my rig set up anytime I want for landscape or portrait shoots. A lot of my commercial and corporate shoots end up being mostly in a run and gun setting, where we always seem to be really tight on time and also really tight on space for gear. And for me personally, permanently having my gimbal set up and ready to go for both landscape and portrait without needing to bring extra parts with me or remove one part for another has enough convenience benefits that outweighs its quirks. While you still need to rebalance your gimbal when you switch orientations, it's much faster to rebalance when your camera can stay on the gimbal and only your tilt axis needs to move height-wise rather than having it be adjusted forward and backwards as well. With DJI's original options, you have to take the camera off the mount, then you take the mount off the gimbal to replace it with the vertical mount, and you have to redo the balancing altogether. At the end of the day, the choice is entirely up to you. Do you find yourself shooting a lot of portrait and landscape videos at the same time? Do you find it valuable to save the extra few minutes it might take to switch out between the landscape mount and the portrait mount? If so, NEEWER's vertical camera mount might just be the solution you've been looking for. But if you mostly only shoot landscape, or if you don't mind setting up your camera for either landscape mode or portrait mode only for your entire shoot, then DJI's original mounts are a bit lighter and they're definitely more sturdy because they're one piece, and those might be the best choice for you. If you've used these mounts on DJI gimbals, let me know which one you prefer and why in the comments below. If you've been wondering why my RS2 looks like this instead of its original skinnier self, check out the video on the screen. Thanks for watching, guys.